So our first reading today is Psalm 31, verses 1 through 5. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. Since you are my rock and my fortress, for the sake of your name, lead and guide me. Keep me free from the trap that is set for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. And the second reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verses 1 through 7. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. May God bless the hearing and the living of this word. And from the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, Divine Providence, number 60. We can know the path to heaven to some extent simply by considering what the people who make up heaven are like, realizing that no one can become an angel or get to heaven unless he or she arrives bringing along some angelic quality from the world. Inherent in that angelic quality is a knowing of the path from having walked it, and a walking in the path from the knowing of it. There really are paths in the spiritual world, paths that lead to each community of heaven and to each community of hell. We all see our own paths spontaneously, it seems. We see them because the paths are there for the loves of each individual. Love opens the paths and leads us to our kindred spirits. No one sees any paths except of his or her love. We can see from this that angels are simply heavenly loves, since otherwise they would have not seen the paths that lead to heaven. So, my friends, I'm about to preach to you today a sermon that I actually preached a year ago on Mother's Day. And I thought it'd be really interesting to see how we might be hearing this sermon a full year later. You'll notice that I start out talking about grief, but then I segue into birth. And last year, we're perhaps pretty much in that grieving phase. And now it seems like we might be more in the birthing phase. But the important point is that the grief and the birthing are connected, that when we accept the fullness of our experience, then that can lead to birthing new things. And I recognize that there are so many layers for us to process of our experience of this year going forward for years to come, and that it is reasonable and expected that we will return to the cycle of grief over and over again. So this is my offering for Mother's Day, a year later. We heard in our reading, Jesus said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." Now, I find this might be one of the times when I really want to question the text, because there's a lot in the world to trouble us. Even before the pandemic, there was plenty to be troubled about. And it doesn't really sit quite right to have Jesus be saying not to let my heart be troubled, as if being faithful somehow means being detached from all the injustice, all the loss, all the inequity, and all the grief in the world. Now, whenever I'm challenged by something I read in the Bible, I find it helpful to look a little deeper to see if the context helps to ground what's being expressed. So, first, I think it is helpful to see that right before Jesus says, "Do not let your heart be troubled," he predicts that Peter will disown him 3 times. In fact, in the previous chapter, what has happened is that Jesus washes his disciples' feet, predicts his betrayal by Judas, with Judas right in front of him, by the way, commands the disciples to love one another, and then tells Peter that he will disown him 3 times. And then, after all that, Jesus says, "Do not let your heart be troubled." Now, on the face of it, that seems even more ridiculous. How could the disciples not be troubled by the crazy roller coaster ride that was happening to them? But I think if we look deeper, we can see that Jesus is actually anticipating the fullness of their experience, anticipating their grief and their uncertainty, and helping them to see their way through it. I don't think Jesus is saying that to be faithful means not being sad. I don't think he is saying to be unmoved or to not grieve for the brokenness we see in the world. He is saying that in all of it, we do not need to feel internally agitated, unmoored, or desperate, because God is with us. The word in the text that is translated as troubled is the Greek word tarasso, and it indicates agitation, being stirred up, literally movement to and fro, which sounds like to me like a specific state that is really more like anxiety or defensiveness, a state that prevents us from being present to what is actually happening to us. And I think the antidote to that state is not detachment or escape or rising above our life, but rather recognizing what is expressed in Psalm 31. With God as our refuge and rock, we can be grounded enough to squarely face whatever is happening. We can have the courage and the fortitude to feel it all in fullness. We don't have to retreat into denial or dismissal or numbness or conspiracy theories. We won't need simple answers to complex problems just to make ourselves feel better. With God as our rock, we can see the world as it truly is, feel everything that we are given to feel, and not be afraid of what it might mean. For the disciples, grief was a reasonable reaction to seeing their friend and mentor die so terribly. Grief was a reasonable reaction to their own failures. Grief is a reasonable reaction to what we have experienced this whole year. We have witnessed the death of the vulnerable, both due to the pandemic and white supremacy. We have witnessed overwhelm and exhaustion on the part of all of our doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. We have seen ordinary people, our friends and neighbors, lose their livelihoods or struggle in other ways. And as much as we have seen people come together, we are also seeing divisions widen. There is so much to grieve. And I know that I have preached about grief so much this year, and that is because grief isn't a one and done experience. It comes in waves. It goes out and in like the tide. And so as we experience this ongoing collective trauma, it is reasonable that our feelings may come and go in a similar way. And one reason I want to return to the topic of grief today, on Mother's Day, is because of what I see as the relationship between grief and the mothering impulse. There are lots of things that we think of when we think of mothering. One thing that seems to me to be inherent to the mothering impulse is to see the suffering of another and wish to ameliorate that pain somehow, to share the burden of the pain so it might be lessened for another, and being willing to sacrifice something of the self so that another might thrive. And to be clear, I'm not saying that only mothers can engage in the mothering impulse. I'm talking more broadly about something that is very human, something that all people can engage in and participate in. Being a mother in a family certainly does give someone lots of opportunities to engage with and practice and express the mothering impulse, but I wouldn't call it exclusive to that relationship only. We can see it in lots of places. Jesus, for example, gives us a powerful example of the mothering impulse. Jesus' very birth was demonstrative of God's mothering impulse, wherein God saw the suffering of humanity and reached out. Jesus continued then to embody the mothering impulse by ministering to those unseen and suffering, and then finally sacrificing himself so that we might see and understand the ways in which our selfish choices are poisoning our own hearts. Indeed, on the very cross, forgiving us, enfolding and holding the grief and blindness of the world, taking it upon himself. In a very real way, when we are feeling the enormous grief that has accompanied this pandemic and all of its effects, when we truly feel it, we are each of us mothering the world in our own small way. Each of us acting in partnership with the mothering impulse of God, a God who feels the grief of our world in every moment. But this mothering impulse is not passive. It does not exist solely to be martyred, to vacuum up the world's grief and make it go away, to make us feel more comfortable. The mothering impulse also insists upon the birthing that is to come. For as much as I have been preaching about grief this year, I have also been preaching about newness. A pregnant woman not only endures painful contractions, but uses them to bring about birth. One of the most useful pieces of advice that I received from my midwife when giving birth to my own children was to enter into the pain of the contractions and to flow with them rather than to resist them. To accept them as something that could give me power, not just to simply endure the process, but to be the one who actively brought new life into the world. And I'm sure that the disciples wished that Jesus would have resisted his crucifixion, wished he would have spoken up and defended himself at his trial. But his purpose was not self-preservation. His purpose was to submit deeply to the most bleak of human failures and then to reframe it as a powerful contraction, something that would give birth to new human possibility, something that would provide new life. And this is the way that Jesus speaks of, the way, the truth, and the life. Now, birth and rebirth is one kind of language for the way and the truth and the life, but there are other ways of describing it too. You already know as a gardener how much I love gardening metaphors. And the Reverend Anna Woofenden uses the notion of compost as a way to describe how God works in the world and in us. I quote from her book, "The more I learned about compost, the more I saw the image of God in it, proclaiming the work she does in the world. God is the divine composter. She takes all that has been, all that we've used, our best bits and our slimy bits, the endings in our lives and the pain of loss, the tantalizing crumbs from our joyful moments and the leftovers we've kept for too long. God takes all of that and says, okay, great. Let's see what we can do with it next." Our best bits, our slimy bits, endings, loss, joy, and the things we wish we could hold on to. This sounds a lot like that Last Supper with Jesus and the disciples that we described earlier, full of tenderness, betrayal, love, and confusion. It sounds a lot like life. And I think sometimes we want our faith to be like a shield, something that is supposed to make everything okay. That if Jesus says, "Don't let your heart be troubled," then we think avoiding sadness will mean that we're doing something right. But I think instead that faith is more like a resilient immune system, or like bacteria in compost, or like the process of birth. There might be fever, there might be breakdown, there might be contractions, but the fever, the breakdown, the contractions, they are not evidence that something is going wrong. They are evidence that new life is on the way. I know that I feel troubled, as in agitated and afraid, when I think the breakdown is all there is, when I'm afraid that new life isn't possible. Faith, though, is believing in the process and being willing to ride it out. We read in our Swedenborg reading that it is an angelic quality to know the path from having walked in it, and then to walk in the path from this knowing of it. To truly know the way, we must be willing to walk in that way and let that experience change us and lead us. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, the way that embraces truth and leads to life. Amen.